It all started the moment I swung open my front door and froze, staring at the three strange packages dumped in the center of my garage like ticking time bombs. Beside them, parked awkwardly behind my neighbor's rose bushes, was a nondescript white van with blacked-out windows. Two men inside, both wearing sunglasses even though it was cloudy, gave me the tiniest of nods. Before I could process what was happening, I heard the unmistakable clatter of Karen's flip-flops on the driveway next door, her shrill voice announcing her presence to her yappy dog, Muffin, and to anyone else within a mile radius. She spotted the packages immediately. I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head. In that moment, standing half inside my garage and half in the rain, I realized my life had just shifted onto a collision course with the biggest disaster our 808 had ever seen. The truth was, these weren't ordinary packages. 2 days earlier, a pair of straight-faced agents had shown up at my door, flashing badges so quickly it made my head spin. They needed my help, they said. A rash of package thefts had plagued our neighborhood, costing residents thousands, but no one could catch the thief red-handed. They had tried sting operations elsewhere, but nothing stuck. Here, however, they had an idea. They needed someone whose property was easily visible, close to the sidewalk, and unfortunately, known for having an unhinged neighbor with sticky fingers. That's right, Karen. At first, I thought it was some elaborate prank. Me, helped the FBI. But when they pulled out the paperwork, explained the plan, and hinted that it could lead to shutting down not just a petty thief, but an entire underground resale ring, I was sold. Plus, the idea of watching Karen squirm when caught in the act was too delicious to pass up. I agreed, half amused, half terrified. The plan was simple. Leave a few tempting packages visible inside my garage, slightly open the door like a lazy afterthought, and let human nature do the rest. Cameras were hidden everywhere. Inside the garage, on the lamppost across the street, even in a fake birdhouse perched outside my window. All I had to do was act normal, which was already failing miserably because Karen was sniffing around like a bloodhound. By the end of the first day, Karen had walked by my house 5 times. 5. Each time she lingered a little longer, squinting through the gap in the garage door, dragging poor Muffin to a standstill while she pretended to adjust her shoelaces or take a very intense phone call about absolutely nothing. I made a show of ignoring her. I mowed my lawn, watered the plants, cleaned the gutters, but from the corner of my eye, I watched her, and from the van, so did the agents. On the second day, the real fun began. Around noon, I noticed Karen wasn't just walking anymore. She was surveying. She paced in front of my driveway, making careful mental notes like a jewel thief casing a museum. I even caught her pretending to trip so she could peer under the garage door. I nearly choked on my coffee. Meanwhile, the agents texted me updates. "She's on the hook," one said. "Anytime now." That night, just before sunset, I heard a noise. Not the casual shuffle of footsteps. No, this was something heavier, more determined. Metal clanking. I peeked through the curtains. There she was, Karen, hunched over at the edge of my driveway, crowbar in hand, fiddling with the garage latch like she was opening a can of tuna. Muffin sat loyally by her side, tail wagging, utterly clueless. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might rattle the windows. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the agents, but before I could, Karen caught sight of the security camera perched above the garage. She froze. A full 5 seconds of deer in the headlights panic. Then she bolted, dragging Muffin behind her like a deranged parade float. The agents told me to stay calm. They wanted more. They wanted her caught red-handed with the goods, so they retooled the plan. The next morning, 3 brand new packages appeared, bigger and flashier than before. They were made to look like a gold mine. Flat screens, expensive purses, electronics, everything Karen's greedy little heart could desire. And to make sure she noticed, they left the garage door a little wider this time, just enough to reveal the shimmering promise inside. Karen didn't disappoint. That afternoon, under the cover of a sudden rainstorm, she made her move. I watched from my window as she darted across the street, a giant trash bag slung over her shoulder. She crouched low, scrambled under the garage door, and stuffed the packages into the bag one by one, her hair plastered to her face with rain. She moved fast, a woman possessed, fueled by the thought of untold riches waiting for her at home. I barely had time to blink before the agents sprung into action. 2 black SUVs came screeching around the corner. Uniformed men spilled out, guns drawn, shouting orders. Karen dropped the bag and raised her hands in the air, the picture of guilty innocence, her voice climbing 3 octaves as she shrieked about being tricked and neighborly misunderstandings. The agents weren't having it. They slapped cuffs on her and rid her rights as the entire neighborhood poured onto their porches, phones recording, jaws dropping. Standing there behind my curtains, I couldn't help but feel a tiny, wicked flicker of satisfaction. Karen had spent years terrorizing the HOA, writing nasty letters, calling in petty complaints, and acting like queen of the block. Now here she was, wet, miserable, and utterly defeated, arrested in front of the very neighbors she had spent years tormenting. But little did I know, this was just the beginning, because what the FBI uncovered next would blow this quiet little neighborhood sky high. And Karen, she had no idea just how deep the hole she had dug for herself really went. The agents moved quickly, securing the scene like a well-rehearsed dance. Karen stood there, dripping wet and whimpering, her designer flip-flops sliding on the wet concrete. Muffin, oblivious to the seriousness of the situation, wagged his tail and tried to lick the nearest agent's boot. As they placed Karen into the back of the black SUV, she kept babbling incoherently about how she thought the packages were abandoned, how she was just helping out, how she was looking out for the neighborhood. None of it mattered. The invisible dye the FBI had sprayed on the packages was now smeared all over her hands, arms, and even her expensive yoga pants, glowing a brilliant neon under the portable black lights. The agents casually waved over her. The evidence wasn't just circumstantial. It was practically radioactive. As the agents collected the packages, documented the scene, and packed up their gear, I stayed inside as instructed, peeking through the blinds with a mixture of giddy satisfaction and sheer disbelief. I couldn't believe it had actually worked. Karen, the self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, the queen of HOA complaint letters, the terror of poorly parked cars and lawn ornaments everywhere, had finally been caught red-handed, and it wasn't for some petty misdemeanor either. It was grand theft, federal theft, mail fraud, and a few other charges I couldn't even pronounce. The magnitude of what she had stepped into was breathtaking. About an hour after Karen was carted off, Agent Rodriguez, the lead agent on the case, knocked on my door. He looked much less formal now, rain dripping off his jacket, a half-smile playing on his face. I invited him in, still slightly jittery from the adrenaline crash. He sat down at my kitchen table and pulled out a folder thicker than a Sunday newspaper. Rodriguez explained that the packages Karen stole were just the tip of the iceberg. They had been tracking a regional package theft ring for months, a ring that stole goods, sold them online through fake accounts, and laundered the money through sham charities and bogus e-commerce websites. Until now, they had struggled to find the link between the low-level thieves and the organized criminals higher up the chain. But Karen, in her infinite arrogance and greed, had handed them the connection on a silver platter. Apparently, Karen's online activities had caught their attention weeks earlier. She had been using several alias accounts to sell what she claimed were estate sale finds and overstock donations. In reality, most of it was stolen goods, electronics, fashion items, jewelry, even medical equipment. The kicker was that a chunk of the money was funneled into a fake nonprofit she had set up under the heartwarming name Helping Heroes Foundation, which, according to their flashy website, provided supplies and support to veterans in need. In truth, not a single penny ever reached a veteran. Every dime had been laundered into her personal accounts, used to fund her luxury vacations, endless home renovations, and that ridiculous backyard fountain she bragged about at every HOA meeting. I sat there, stunned, as Agent Rodriguez laid it all out. This wasn't just Karen being a nosy busybody. This was federal-level fraud. He told me the agents were already executing search warrants on Karen's house and her secret storage unit downtown. And the preliminary findings were wild. racks of unopened electronics, rows of designer handbags, even sealed medical supplies meant for disaster relief efforts were tucked away in her secret stash. She had amassed what amounted to a small department store's worth of stolen goods, all hidden behind her carefully crafted image of a concerned neighbor. The next morning, the news vans arrived. "Local woman arrested in federal sting" was the headline plastered across every major news station in the state. Reporters knocked on doors, neighbors huddled together whispering excitedly, and teenagers on bikes rode up and down the street, filming the aftermath on their phones. Karen's husband, a mild-mannered accountant who barely spoke at HOA meetings, looked absolutely devastated as he was escorted from their home, a small box of personal belongings in his hands. He hadn't been charged with anything yet, but the rumor mill was already working overtime. Some said he was complicit. Others thought he was just another one of Karen's many victims. Meanwhile, the HOA went into full meltdown. The board called an emergency meeting at the community clubhouse, ostensibly to discuss neighborhood safety and next steps. Everyone knew what it was really about: damage control. I decided to attend, partly out of curiosity, partly because I wanted to see how they would spin it. As I walked in, I caught glares from several board members, especially Victoria, the HOA president, who had once nominated Karen for the Good Neighbor Award 3 years in a row. She looked like she had swallowed a lemon. The meeting was chaos from the start. Victoria tried to maintain order, banging her little wooden gavel and calling for calm, but it was hopeless. Residents shouted over each other, demanding answers. Why weren't we warned about an FBI operation on our street? How long had Karen been stealing? Were other homes involved? One older gentleman in the back, Mr. Jenkins, yelled out that Karen had once borrowed his package and claimed it was a mix-up. But now he wondered if she had been stealing all along. At one point, someone even demanded to know if the HOA bore any liability for endorsing a criminal by allowing Karen to serve on the Neighborhood Beautification Committee. That question hit Victoria like a slap. Her face flushed bright red, and she stammered through a non-answer about moving forward with community unity. Just when it seemed the room might explode, Agent Rodriguez and another agent walked in. All business. You could have heard a pin drop. Rodriguez addressed the crowd, laying out a brief, careful explanation of the sting. He assured everyone that the operation had been conducted with the utmost caution and that the FBI had intervened the moment it became necessary. He thanked me specifically for my cooperation, which drew several surprised gasps and a few grudging nods. Rodriguez also made it crystal clear: anyone who had aided or knowingly benefited from the theft ring could be facing federal charges themselves. The HOA members immediately shut up after that. Walking home from the clubhouse, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief that it was finally over, satisfaction that Karen was getting exactly what she deserved, and a bit of lingering disbelief that my ordinary, boring suburban life had turned into something straight out of a crime drama. Little did I know, however, the aftermath was about to get even crazier. Karen's arrest was just the tip of the iceberg. The real storm was only beginning to brew. The days that followed Karen's arrest felt like living in the eye of a hurricane, calm on the surface but vibrating with barely contained chaos underneath. At first, there was a strange, almost eerie stillness around the neighborhood. Karen's house, once a hub of drama and unwanted HOA enforcement, now sat silent and abandoned, its front porch still cluttered with the last remnants of her chaotic life. A tipped-over garden gnome, a broken hanging plant, and a weathered neighborhood watch captain sign served as sad little monuments to her fall from grace. Every time I walked past, I noticed neighbors slowing down too, casting sideways glances as if expecting Karen to pop out and start lecturing about lawn heights or mailbox paint colors. But she was gone, and something much bigger was brewing behind the scenes. It didn't take long for the rumors to ignite. It started small, with a whispered conversation at the local coffee shop. Someone claimed Karen wasn't just stealing packages, but running a full-blown black market operation from her basement. Another swore they had seen suspicious trucks coming and going from her driveway late at night over the past year. Stories snowballed. By the end of the week, Half the town was convinced Karen was the mastermind behind some international theft syndicate. While most of those stories were pure fantasy, what the FBI uncovered during their deeper investigation turned out to be even more shocking than anyone had guessed. Through recovered laptops, burner phones, and hidden financial records, they traced Karen's operation back nearly 3 years. She hadn't been working alone. She had cultivated a network of petty thieves, disgruntled delivery drivers, and shady middlemen, all orchestrated through encrypted messaging apps and shell websites. She used her fake charity as a cover, laundering thousands of dollars worth of stolen goods under the guise of donations and relief shipments. On paper, it all looked legitimate, right down to the fake thank you letters she had generated from made-up veteran organizations. The scale of it all was mind-blowing. Karen, who used to patrol the neighborhood with a clipboard documenting whose grass was half an inch too long, had quietly built herself an empire of crime beneath our noses. She had taken a common suburban nuisance, package theft, and industrialized it. By the time the FBI finished tallying it all up, they estimated Karen had facilitated over $500,000 in stolen goods flowing through her little operation. It wasn't just petty theft anymore. It was organized crime, and it had been operating out of a 2-story colonial with bad siding and an overgrown juniper bush. The HOA, predictably, panicked. Overnight, they switched from pretending Karen never existed to pretending they had been suspicious of her all along. Victoria, in particular, reinvented herself as the tireless protector of the community. She held daily briefings at the clubhouse, sent out long-winded emails about new neighborhood security protocols, and insisted everyone install new, approved mailbox locks. The hypocrisy was so thick it could have been bottled and sold as syrup. No one bought her act, but most people were too busy gawking at the unfolding drama to care. The biggest blow came when the FBI executed a civil forfeiture against Karen's property. Everything she owned, from her cars to her bank accounts to her home itself, was seized. Her husband, who somehow had managed to remain legally untangled from the mess, moved out quietly one morning with nothing but a battered suitcase and a very confused muffin trotting behind him. The house sat empty, its windows dark, its blinds drawn, while a bright orange notice from the Department of Justice fluttered on the front door. That was when things got personal for me. Late one evening, I received a polite but firm knock on my door. Agent Rodriguez stood there, a thick envelope in his hand. Inside was an official letter from the FBI outlining a potential reward. Because my cooperation had directly contributed to exposing a significant criminal operation, I was eligible for a substantial financial reward under a federal whistleblower statute. My jaw practically hit the floor when I saw the amount. It wasn't enough to retire on, but it was certainly enough to cause a minor scandal if word got out. Rodriguez cautioned me to keep it quiet for now, at least until the court proceedings finished. But the reality was staggering. 1 month ago, I was just a regular guy arguing with Karen about her dog pooping on my lawn. Now I was part of a federal case and about to be substantially richer for it. But of course, nothing involving Karen could be simple. Just when we all thought the worst was over, new charges surfaced. Turns out Karen hadn't only stolen packages. During her time serving on the HOA board's finance committee, she had quietly siphoned funds from the neighborhood improvement budget. Thousands of dollars earmarked for playground upgrades, sidewalk repairs, and community events had simply disappeared. The bank records were a mess. The audits were non-existent. And the few HOA members who should have been paying attention were too busy measuring flower beds to notice. The news exploded again. Local reporters swarmed the neighborhood. News vans camped outside the clubhouse. HOA members scrambled to find excuses, pointing fingers at each other, claiming ignorance. Victoria tried to frame it as a betrayal of trust by a rogue individual, but nobody bought it. The residents were furious. People demanded refunds, resignations, and lawsuits. Several even began organizing to have the entire HOA dissolved, a movement that picked up stunning speed almost overnight. For me, it was a surreal experience watching it all unfold. A month earlier, the biggest drama on the block was whether Tim at the end of the street could keep his inflatable Santa up past New Year's. Now, the entire neighborhood was unraveling at the seams. and at the center of the storm was a woman who once fined me $50 for parking my truck half an inch over the sidewalk. In the midst of the chaos, I found an odd sense of peace. Karen was gone. Justice, real justice, was happening. And as the lawsuits and investigations piled up, it became clear that her crimes had done something no one thought possible. She had finally united the neighborhood. People who hadn't spoken to each other in years were now swapping stories, sharing laughs, and planning to take back control of the community from the hollow, broken remnants of the HOA board. As for me, I knew better than to relax completely. In a world where people like Karen existed, there was always another storm on the horizon. But for now, I allowed myself to enjoy the rarest of suburban miracles: a little peace, a lot of vindication, and the sweet, sweet satisfaction of watching karma do what it does best. It did not take long for the media frenzy to become a full-blown circus, and somehow, without even trying, I found myself dragged into it. It started with a single local news station wanting an anonymous statement about the brave citizen who helped the FBI bring down the suburban theft ring. I agreed under strict anonymity, thinking it would just be a small blip in the news cycle. Instead, it blew up. Before the week was out, my garage had become something of a minor tourist attraction. People drove by slowly, taking pictures, pointing at the infamous door where Karen had stolen the bait packages. Some even had the nerve to knock and ask for a tour, like it was a museum. I started parking my car in front of the garage just to block the view and give myself some semblance of privacy again. But privacy wasn't something the HOA seemed interested in preserving. They called another emergency meeting, this time with a much angrier undertone. The board, already humiliated by the exposure of Karen's financial misdeeds, was desperate to regain some kind of control, and apparently their plan was to turn me into the scapegoat. The letter they delivered to my mailbox was dripping with passive-aggressive formalities. It stated that recent activity surrounding certain homeowners had brought unwanted attention and danger to the community, and therefore, fines would be discussed for endangering the peace and reputation of the neighborhood. It was laughable, but it also made me furious. After everything Karen had done, after everything I had helped uncover, they had the nerve to try and pin the blame on me for embarrassing them. The meeting was a disaster from the moment it started. Victoria stood at the front of the room, tight-lipped and trembling slightly, gripping her stack of papers like they were a lifeline. She launched into a speech about community values, trust, and responsibility. I sat in the second row, arms crossed, watching the spectacle with detached amusement. Then she dropped the bomb, proposing an official motion to fine me for conduct unbecoming a homeowner. The crowd erupted. People shouted over one another, some furious that the board would even suggest punishing me, others too confused to know who to be mad at. Several neighbors who had never spoken more than 2 words to me before stood up and defended me, pointing out that I had worked with the FBI and risked my own safety to stop a serious crime. Before things could spiral further, a familiar voice cut through the noise. Agent Rodriguez, who had been standing quietly at the back of the room, stepped forward. He wore a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. Calmly, he introduced himself again for anyone who had forgotten, and then laid out in excruciating detail how the sting operation had been not only approved at the federal level, but had also been necessary to prevent a much larger criminal enterprise from taking root in the neighborhood. He politely but firmly reminded everyone that attempting to retaliate against a cooperating citizen could be seen as obstruction of justice. The room fell into a dead silence. Victoria's face turned a shade of purple I had never seen on a human before. She mumbled something about tabling the motion for further review and quickly adjourned the meeting. Walking out of that room felt like winning a war I hadn't even asked to fight. Several neighbors clapped me on the back, thanking me. Others apologized for not speaking up sooner. It was surreal. A month ago, these people had barely acknowledged my existence, and now I was some kind of reluctant hero. As much as I appreciated the support, I also knew this wasn't over. The HOA was bleeding credibility, and wounded animals were always the most dangerous. Sure enough, the fallout came swiftly. Within a week, several board members, including Victoria, resigned under pressure. A group of neighbors, galvanized by the exposure of the board's negligence, filed a formal petition to dissolve the HOA entirely. The momentum was unstoppable. Meetings turned into rallies. Lawn signs sprang up overnight declaring, "Take back our neighborhood." People who had once dutifully paid every fine without question were now demanding audits, refunds, and apologies. It was the kind of grassroots rebellion OVA horror stories online only dream about, and it was happening right in front of me. Amidst the chaos, I received an unexpected visitor one morning. It was Karen's husband, Paul. He looked like he had aged 10 years in just a few weeks. His clothes hung loose on him, and there was a hollow look in his eyes. He stood awkwardly on my porch, clutching a manila envelope. I hesitated but stepped outside to hear him out. In a low, tired voice, he apologized, not for Karen's actions directly, but for the years of grief and harassment she had caused everyone. He handed me the envelope, said he hoped it would help, and then left without another word. Inside were copies of bank statements, invoices, and internal OA emails, evidence that Karen had been embezzling money for years. He must have found them while packing up what little remained of his life. I forwarded everything to Agent Rodriguez, who was practically giddy with the new ammunition. With Paul's documents, they were able to uncover even more fraudulent activity tied back to Karen. It sealed her fate. She was hit with additional charges, pushing her potential prison sentence well past a decade. The best part was that Paul's information also helped the neighborhood in a very tangible way. The stolen Elvowood funds were traced, seized, and through a messy but satisfying legal battle, partially returned to the community. It wasn't everything that had been lost, but it was enough to repair the playground, fix the sidewalks, and even host a small neighborhood festival, celebrating the HOA's dissolution. The irony was delicious. As the festival date approached, I found myself sitting on my porch one evening, watching as volunteers set up tents, lights, and food trucks. Children laughed and played in the street. Couples strolled hand in hand. It was the first time in years the neighborhood had felt genuinely alive, not suffocated by petty rules and power-hungry neighbors. I thought back to the packages in my garage, the quiet knock of the FBI agents on my door, and the chaos that followed. I never wanted to be a hero. I never wanted to be at the center of anything. But somehow, in the middle of all the madness, something good had grown out of it. Karen had tried to tear our community apart for her own gain. In the end, her downfall had brought everyone closer together. It was almost funny how life works sometimes. A stolen package here, a botched theft there, and suddenly you're standing at the heart of a story bigger than you ever imagined. I sipped my coffee and watched the sun dip below the horizon, feeling the rarest and most precious thing a man can feel after surviving a storm like this: peace. Real, honest, hard-won peace. And deep down, a tiny part of me almost wished Karen could see it. Almost. Karen's trial became the grand finale nobody had expected, but everybody eagerly anticipated. The courthouse was packed on the day of her sentencing, the atmosphere buzzing with a strange mixture of anticipation and grim satisfaction. I sat quietly in the back, blending into the rows of neighbors, journalists, and a few familiar faces from the old HOA board who showed up out of morbid curiosity or perhaps in some desperate attempt to salvage their reputations. Karen shuffled into the courtroom wearing an ill-fitting gray suit that looked like it had been borrowed from a discount rack, her usual arrogant posture replaced by a slumped, beaten-down stance. Gone was the woman who had once strutted through the neighborhood issuing citations for lawn ornaments and unmowed grass. Now she looked like a shadow of herself, smaller, older, and deeply, visibly afraid. The prosecutor laid out the case in brutal detail, methodically recounting Karen's crimes like taking off items from a particularly dandy grocery list: theft of mail, mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, embezzlement. Each charge carried its own heavy weight, and together they painted a portrait of a woman who had spent years spinning an elaborate web of lies and greed at the expense of everyone around her. The evidence was overwhelming. Video footage, financial records, recorded phone calls, eyewitness testimony, and thanks to Paul's last-minute evidence dump, a trail of bank transfers so incriminating that even Karen's lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she stood up, shaking slightly, and tried to muster up some semblance of defiance. She blamed everyone but herself. She blamed the community for isolating her, the FBI for setting her up, even her own husband for not supporting her ambitions. Her voice broke several times, not out of genuine remorse but out of pure frustration that the world was no longer bending to her will. It was a sad, pathetic performance, and the judge was clearly unmoved. He handed down a sentence of 10 years without the possibility of parole, citing not only the scope of her crimes, but her utter lack of remorse and the breach of trust she had committed against her own neighbors. The gavel slammed down with a finality that echoed through the silent courtroom. As Karen was led away in handcuffs, she cast one last look at the courtroom, her eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. When they landed on me, there was a flicker of recognition, and for the briefest second, I thought I saw a spark of the old Karen, the one who had once threatened to fine me for leaving my garbage cans out an extra 15 minutes. But it vanished just as quickly, swallowed by the grim reality of her situation. She disappeared through the side door, leaving behind only the chaos she had created. The aftermath of her sentencing rippled through the community in ways no one had anticipated. Without Karen and the crumbling remnants of the HOA board, the neighborhood found itself in a rare position, free to rebuild, free to redefine itself, free to heal from years of micromanagement and manufactured conflict. The dissolution of the HOA was finalized in a special vote held 2 weeks after Karen's sentencing, and the turnout was overwhelming. Signs came down, arbitrary rules were scrapped, and people started to breathe again. It was as if a giant invisible weight had been lifted from the entire neighborhood. The celebration that followed was unlike anything I had ever seen. The festival that had started as a small gathering quickly grew into a full-blown community event. Food trucks lined the street. Live bands played in the park. Kids ran wild with balloons and ice cream smeared across their faces. I wandered through the crowd, shaking hands, sharing laughs, feeling like I had stumbled into a version of the neighborhood I had always hoped for, but never believed could actually exist. At the center of the park stood a brand new community bulletin board, erected where Karen had once insisted on placing the ugliest, most unnecessary HOA sign warning about unauthorized lawn ornaments. Instead of rules and threats, the new board was covered with photos of families, invitations to block parties, offers for babysitting swaps, and hand-drawn thank you notes from neighborhood kids. It was a living testament to what we had gained and what we had survived. The biggest surprise came when the auction for Karen's foreclosed house was announced. I hadn't planned on bidding. Honestly, I thought someone else would snap it up quickly, but fate had a funny way of nudging things along. On a whim, encouraged by a few neighbors and maybe by a lingering sense of poetic justice, I placed a bid. Thanks to the stigma surrounding the property, competition was light, and before I knew it, I was holding the deed to Karen's old house in my hands. I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. The plans came together quickly. Tear down the fences Karen had put up to isolate herself, rip out the hideous Fox Italian fountain she had installed without approval, and convert the entire property into a community dog park. It felt fitting. Where Karen had once tried to control, divide, and dominate, her former land would now be a place of joy, openness, and community. We named it Karen's K9 Corner, a tongue-in-cheek nod to the woman who had tried so hard to turn the neighborhood into her personal kingdom. A carved wooden sign stood proudly at the entrance, engraved with a cheerful message about community spirit and second chances. On opening day, the park was packed. Dogs of every shape and size ran free. Kids played fetch. Parents chatted and lounged on the newly built benches. Laughter echoed across the fields that had once been forbidden zones patrolled by Karen's critical gaze. As I sat on one of the benches, watching Muffin, now adopted by a sweet older couple from down the block, chase after a tennis ball with more energy than I thought possible, I realized something important. Sometimes the people who try the hardest to control everything end up creating the very chaos they fear most. Karen had tried to rule the neighborhood through fear, suspicion, and petty tyranny. In the end, all she had done was bring us closer together, stronger, wiser, and infinitely more united. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the sun warm my face. For the first time in a long time, there were no angry letters, no threats of fines, no surveillance disguised as neighborly concern, just the simple, perfect sound of a community finally finding its own rhythm, free from the chains of one woman's madness. It was a victory sweeter than anything a court could hand down, a peace earned through chaos, patience, and a little bit of well-timed karma. And as the breeze carried the joyful barking of dogs through the air, I smiled, knowing that whatever storms might come next, we would face them together, stronger, smarter, and finally free.